The very last speaker for today will be Associate Professor Hunyh, who is the Director of Endocrinology and Diabetes at the Queensland Children's Hospital. And he is also a principal investigator in a number of type 1 diabetes studies, and he is collaborator on the ATIC, on India, and also on the JDRF Global Center for Excellence. And he will attempt the challenge of making a summary of the afternoon session. Thank you.
Thanks, Dorota. I've been asked to keep it short by Mark, so I'm going to try and do that. So I've been given the task of summarising a very science-intensive session, but I'm also cognizant of the fact that I'm the only thing standing between you guys and a cocktail function. So just a summary, I suppose we'd had a conversation about paediatric endocrinologists working in this area of disease-modifying therapies. From medical school, this would be our basic understanding of the immunology system that we've sort of learned and carried with us. Pretty good breakdown of the humoral immune response and the cellular response, roles of antigen-presenting cells and B cells in antibody production, and then T cells destroying whatever it needs to destroy. And as we go along, this is basically most of us our understanding of the immune system now. There's some cells in the immune system, and then there's antibodies. And then immunotherapy is basically this, glucocorticoids. That's the immunologist's immunotherapy. So we then go to this, and this is by no means exhaustive. It's actually quite limited when you sort of look at the literature and what's out there, but there are enormous numbers of targets, enormous numbers of basically strategies to try and attenuate the disease process, depending on, even whether you think it's a beta cell condition or it's an immune condition. So there's even some sort of debate currently about whether it's based in beta cell dysfunction or the immune dysfunction. And we talked about some of these therapies. I'm going to do exactly what I was asked to do, and that's to recap the session. So Colin gave us a very thorough overview of type 1 diabetes and the challenges in bringing disease-modifying therapies into type 1 care, and some very interesting historical insights as well, from cyclosporin to teplizumab. I get the impression from a lot of talks today that that big gap between cyclosporin and teplizumab is now accelerating almost exponentially, where we are putting more and more of these therapies into trials. And I found it very, very interesting, those personal insights with your patients about what the barriers are to actually just taking therapy, but also, what might be very, very acceptable to some patients in terms of immunotherapy, because conventional or standard therapy at the moment is not seen as something that they would want long term. Tom talked about the BANDIT study. I think the take-home message here is families are keen. They're keen to engage in trials. We certainly in our clinic, we have a lot of families come and ask us about what else is out there. And I think the team from the BANDIT study demonstrates that Australia and New Zealand have got a huge capacity to do trials. It's a very motivated community, and we're all ready to go for any sort of trials that are going to be onboarded. And there's going to be, he also touched on the fact there's a regulatory path to approval for these studies as well. Lenny talked about teplizumab, TN10, and the promising outcomes. Very sobering that there's 3 decades between actually the concept and also making regulatory approval, and 8 years, to actually complete the trial. So that's 2 very sobering aspects of that. Also the difficulties in stage 3 trials, with primary outcomes being total daily in hemoglobin A1C, and potentially now sort of having markers like C-peptide being more acceptable, and their plan to have the approach of going younger, earlier, and patients with more reserve. And I think really, at the moment, it's how do we make this accessible to families outside of the US, and we've already had some initial conversations. Professor Thomas really highlighted the fact that we should be tapping into the expertise where it's found, similarities in conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis and type 1 diabetes, and her work in terms of using liposome nanotechnology with C-peptide and calcitriol embedded. Irina talked to us about RAGE and also the fact that it's involved in progression to type 1 at risk individuals, and also what's being proposed in terms of using RAGE antagonists as a therapeutic approach. Professor Helen Thomas really just talked broadly about JAK inhibition and potential candidates, and also the whole concept of putting combination therapies in, especially with anti-CD3 therapy. And Andrew basically talked about IL-17 mediated therapies as a therapeutic approach. And I think he really highlighted the fact that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of doing the mechanistic studies, and I'll come back to why that could be a problem just going forward. So the barriers, and I think Colin touched a lot on these barriers and limitations. There are a lot of potential candidates. We've got small numbers of kids, especially in the stage 2 realm, and they're long studies. So there's really a need for an early biomarker of efficacy. If you're on a study for 2 or 3 years, and the actual markers of success, aren't that fantastic, then you can have a lot of patients caught up in a study that may not have a beneficial outcome. We talked about heterogeneity in the actual patient population, and whether precision medicine has a role now, as opposed to concentrating on candidates that which we know have success for a lot of people, not every person. And then talking about combination therapies and trying to understand which combinations will work. And then I think importantly, he talked about a worldwide reach for these studies. So in Australia and New Zealand, we've certainly got a very small population base, so they're going to be small numbers. And I think really the panel touched on the fact that there is still some work to be done in terms of harmonisation of some of these protocols to make sure we're actually comparing apples to apples when we're talking about outcomes. And it's expensive, and we had a fairly robust discussion about the roles of philanthropy and industry and government in terms of funding this research. So from a personal perspective, and this is going to show my age, but this pretty much summarises my feelings at the moment. So Rocky IV, it's Rocky Balboa versus Ivan Drago, and I've put that up on there because there's an excitement when you watch this movie. There's just an excitement about the movie, and this is a really, really exciting area that we're in at the moment. And we're paediatric endocrinologists, we're used to insulin, but this is something that is basically has come, and I think we're all going to have to get on board as endocrinologists, paediatric endocrinologists. And the other sort of analogy, I think, is that it's a formidable, you've got a formidable condition. So Ivan Drago, formidable opponent. Rocky Balboa working out in Moscow in the, was it St. Petersburg or Moscow? Moscow, in the barn. The underdog. But it's got to be business as usual for us. We've got to embed this into our everyday clinics, and certainly we've been lucky at the Queensland Children's Hospital and under the guidance of Mark and Andrew, who've set up a new patient clinic. So there's already a cohort for participation in a lot of these mechanistic studies, and now these sort of immunotherapy studies. And we've set up an early diabetes clinic where we screen siblings, and we see these patients in the clinic with a GP referral. So that's now a clinic that we run to try and facilitate what we're doing. This is going to be a real issue because there's still a lot of mechanistic studies to be done for stage 1, even screening. And there's also a lot of management studies, just routine management studies, so comparing, loop systems versus standard conventional therapy. So a lot of these studies that we're proposing at the moment will alter some of these outcomes for these kids and will make it very difficult to stay on a trial like that. So it's certainly something we're grappling with and something that we're going to have to think going forward about how we manage this. And then a really big thing is equity of access. And I mean, Queensland is a pretty vast state with a lot of inequity in terms of access, not just to this, but just to care generally. And how do we make sure that someone up in the Torres Strait who would like to participate in a trial like this has the opportunity to do so? And then something that's really exciting is, and we talk about sort of succession planning. Simon talked about making sure that we sort of upskill the new generation. So how do we embed this into the training curriculum? And certainly one of the exciting things is that the Scientific Program Organising Committee for ANZPED have ensured that there is a session now around early diabetes and immunotherapy and the ATIC consortium. So that's ensuring that it's becoming more and more visible to our type 1, our paediatric endocrinology community. And that's all I had. Cocktail function.